So GDPR, especially this week and in the last few days, is all over the news at the moment in terms of people not being ready for it. So of course we've seen a lot about GDPR over the last year, 18 months now, but at the moment the big story is people aren't ready for it, they don't understand it. So hopefully this webinar is going to kind of tick that box for you today, and talk to you about exactly what it is. But I'm a firm believer in not just telling people what things are and actually talking about an action plan, what we need to do. But although there are there's some grey areas, there's some areas that kind of need your own interpretation on them within GDPR. There are also some very clear action points that you can take and some things that you absolutely need to do. So that's exactly how we'll finish today, with kind of the action plan of where you go forward from this. Now, just so you all know, you're all muted basically on your webinar at the moment. So if you have any questions, there is a chat box on your sidebar. Please feel free to put any questions that you like along there. If I spot them as I go, it's on a different screen to kind of where I'm focusing, I will try and pick them up. But if not, I'll pick up all the questions at the end. If it's anything that's very specific to your business and I feel like it'd be best to take that offline and have a chat, then I'll do that. But if I think it's applicable to everyone, I'll obviously do my best to answer that. So just to be clear as well from where we go from here, I'm a non-techie, so my role, my day-to-day job is not in technical support from an IT point of view. I basically work in sales and marketing, so when I get in every single morning, my main focus is doing my job. So I'm fascinated by cybersecurity and IT security and cybercrime, because actually I just want an easy life. I want to be able to get on with things, and I don't want the hassles of having to remember a million passwords of ridiculous complexity and being stopped doing this by IT and stopped doing that by IT. But at the same point, on the flip side of that, when I understand what's going on from a cybercrime and a cybersecurity point of view, you understand just why it's so necessary. And we're going to touch on some of those things today. But first and foremost, let's start with GDPR. So GDPR, this is the General Data Protection Regulation. It is due to come in on the 25th of May 2018, and ultimately the key things that it's doing here is it's forcing businesses to act. So for far too long now, businesses have not taken cybersecurity and the privacy of our data seriously enough. So the idea of this new regulation is to force us to do something about it. And the key thing here is about protecting consumers. So let's forget who we all work for at the moment. As individuals, this is about protecting our individual data and how businesses look after it, how they process it, how they use it. That is the heart of GDPR. That is the real spirit of GDPR, about protecting consumer data. It also means that we can be more easily punished. So it's been very difficult in the past to do this because there's been multiple laws across the whole of the EU. So certainly across countries it's been very difficult, and this is going to make that easier. It's also going to put a single regulatory body over the top of it, but ultimately it's going to give a lot more power and a lot more ability to be able to punish anyone that goes off the course of GDPR. And as I say, now we've got one line of guidance as well, so one regulating body, and one single rule that goes across the EU. Now, just to be clear, again, you will have seen lots of stuff in the news recently about what's going on, so it probably does make sense that at the moment the government's obviously in the process of taking all of EU laws and turning them into British laws for when we leave the EU. That's exactly the same from a GDPR point of view. This law will be identical, if not incredibly close to being identical, when it moves over into UK law. So everything we're talking about here today will be applicable when it goes over and when we actually leave the EU. Now, there are about 99 articles in the legislation, so I'm not going to be able to cover it all, but what I'm going to try and do is cover the key parts, what I consider the most important parts to be for small and medium-sized businesses. As I mentioned earlier, there are still some grey areas, there are still some areas of interpretation, so feel free to press me on any of them and I'll do my best to answer them. There is obviously the element here of certainly around fines and how this is enforced. Is we will have to wait and see, because the terminology that's being used is very, very harsh. It's very, very harsh in terms of who's going to get punished, who's going to get fined. In some respects, it seems very harsh how they're talking about it, and I think we will have to see exactly how that pans out come May 2018. But we'll err on the side of caution, and we'll talk about it from how certainly GDPR sees it with a sense of realism over the top, hopefully. Okay, so as I mentioned, GDPR coming in 25th of May 2018. Just to be clear on what that means, this was actually passed 2 years ago. That means that we've all been given 2 years to make sure we comply with GDPR by this date. It doesn't mean from this date we need to start taking it seriously. That is the date it will start being enforced. So we have had 18 months warning so far, or pushing on for that. We've got until May to actually be up to date with that and ready to go. And this basically covers anyone that's touching EU citizen data, whatever it is, whether they're in the EU, out of the EU. And of course, for any business, that could mean your payroll data, as well as obviously any marketing data, any customer data. It pretty much means everyone. Pretty much means everyone. Okay, so why is this important? So this little graph here talks about the total amount of strains of malware that are recognised in the world now. So by malware, we mean malicious software. So this is the sort of viruses and things like that that are used to hack businesses or hack individuals, and the various different types and strains of it that exist. And you can see here through the 80s and the 90s, there wasn't much change when realistically this was a bit of a bedroom industry and it was done for a bit of fun, really to either cause a little bit of embarrassment on someone maybe, or just to annoy them by shutting down their computer. And then you'll see that there's been an absolute spike in what's happened to it. And this is purely around monetization. So nowadays, hackers are looking to make money out of this. And the big one we see now, the one that hits the news with the NHS and everyone else that's been hit, is ransomware, where effectively data on a server or on a PC is encrypted, so a very strong password put on it effectively, and then you're charged to have that encryption key or that incredibly strong password given back to you so you can get your data. And those fines in the SME world have ranged from anywhere between £1,000 and maybe £50,000 on a regular basis, through to Lincolnshire County Council, who reported $1 million ransom not that long ago, through to some of the larger companies where those figures probably don't get published, but obviously we're talking big numbers in that side. So it's a very serious thing, and it is about monetization. This is one of the things that fascinates me, that this is obviously organised crime now. This is all about making money. It's people that have seen an opportunity to hack people and to make money out of it, and that's exactly what's happening. It's a growing industry. So as I mentioned, we've got now one law for all, which will include the UK law, which will be, as I say, identical, if not virtually identical, and fines are very high. So fines here on the screen talking about €20 million. That will be £17 million in the UK, and they're deliberately high. They're deliberately high so that they act as a deterrent, obviously, and also to be proportional. At the moment in the UK, the highest fine is £500,000. So obviously for the larger businesses, this is seen as not a big enough deterrent. So by increasing those fines, this is going to be a much bigger deterrent for those large companies. And it also there says, or 4% of your organisation's global turnover. So these could be even bigger for the bigger companies, basically. On top of this as well, we expect that this is going to open up a whole new area of legal cases as well. So people suing for loss of for damages caused by loss of data, and it's predicted that those actual legal cases could end up being bigger than the fines. Now, this is an area obviously around what will be enforced. So it's a big question here about how this will be enforced, what size of business this will be enforced, what level of if you like, breach of the GDPR will be enforced. The honest answer is we don't know, because it's not enforced. We don't know how serious this will be. Will small businesses be targeted to make an example of? Will it just be the big businesses where they can make more money because of the amount of fines? We honestly don't know. I think from previous history, you would look at similar sort of laws, certainly that have affected marketing in the past, and it has generally been the bigger businesses. But the language that's coming out of this is suggesting that it will be a lot more wholesale in how it's approached. So we have to take it seriously. We will have to see exactly how that pans out. But I think in the build up to this, we've got to say, well, hang on a minute, they are stepping this up to a whole new level. So in order to protect ourselves, we've got two main areas that we need to look at. The first one's around your data process. So how you acquire data, how you use data, and how you remove data from your system, if required. And also your actual security as well. So how you protect your network and stop any potential hacks and stop any potential data breaches. So let's start off with the process side of things when it comes to GDPR. So there's 4 areas here, and we'll work through from top to bottom. So the first one, which has hit the news and is quite well known about, is the right for erasure, or which is also known as the right to be forgotten. So basically this means that if I phoned up a company and said, you've got my data, I want you to remove it, then they would have to do that under GDPR. There are a few exceptions to this, the main one being when there's another legal requirement to keep it. So whether that's to do with financial regulations, criminal convictions, medical history, things like that, there are overrides to that. So it isn't straightforward. But for most businesses that aren't dealing with that sort of data, the right for erasure is absolutely key. Now, in my opinion, most businesses are doing that anyway. If somebody phoned you up and said, I don't want to be on your mailing list anymore, I don't want to receive communications anymore, the sensible thing to do would be to remove them. So chances are you are actually following that through already now. The second one's the right to portability. Now, in my opinion, this is almost directly aimed at people like pension providers, insurance companies, people like that hold more than just your personal details, but actually information about policies and history of policies. So this is the ability to say, actually, I want to move the company that looks after my insurance, and I expect all the history and all of my details to be easily moved from one company to another without any problems. So that's just tightening down on that and actually making that part of that regulation. The next one is explicit consent. And explicit consent is an interesting one because this is one that is a grey area for sure. So basically, from a marketing point of view, what we're talking about here is receiving a little tick box that says, yes, I'm happy to receive your emails, for example. But what we can't have anymore is that box pre-ticked. We can't also have implied consent that sits somewhere in our T's and C's or says, if you want this brochure about whatever it is, GDPR or whatever, then you will get emails whether you like it or not. We actually have to have explicit consent. Now, the B2B world's always been a little bit vaguer than that, and it's been built around implied consent and the words an existing business relationship, which has never been defined. So very vague, could mean maybe that you met them once 3 years ago at a networking meeting and then have continued to keep in touch. So the way this is now being adapted under GDPR is in the B2C world, so dealing with consumers, it won't be enough. From May 2018, you will need explicit consent for something like email using a double opt-in process. So not only do I say, yes, I want them, but I confirm that via my email as well. In other areas such as telemarketing, you would also need to be able to prove consent. So in theory, by call recording, or it does sort of say that you're allowed, and this is grey area, but it indicates that you're allowed to keep a record of the time, the date, and the person you spoke to. Ultimately, if you ever get questioned on this, you need to be able to say, yes, we've done everything we possibly can to follow GDPR, and here's our proof. B2B, again, a little bit vaguer because there was an expectation that something called the e-privacy directive, which is a separate legislation, would be built into GDPR and almost amalgamated to bring B2B in line, and it hasn't. And what that basically means is that B2B works in an opt-out basis. So if you're emailing people, you have to give them a very easy removal of consent, which is our next point, and that is sufficient. So you can email people, but as long as they can remove themselves easily, then under the e-privacy directive, then you're covered basically. There is a feeling that this could change, and obviously we've still got a few months to go, but as things stand, that is where we are. And finally, like I say, easy removal of consent. So it's similar to the right for erasure, but it's actually just saying that it shouldn't be made difficult for someone to remove themselves from, for example, your mailing list. They should be able to easily say, I want to unsubscribe to that, and they're gone. So making it nice and simple, not a really complex process for them. There are a few exceptions to data and how we remove it and how we get rid of it. The obvious one is backups. So, for example, if you think of your business backup, it's very difficult to, if I said remove my data, it's very difficult to remove one person's data from backup. Now, this is again another grey area, but in theory, if you ever had to go to backup and restore your backup and you had removed me from your original system, when that backup went through, you would then be restoring my data that you had followed completely correctly from the right for erasure, but now it's bringing it back online. Now, there is no direct advice on how to fix this from GDPR, but realistically, we go back to that whole idea of can we prove it? So do we keep maybe we keep a record of the people that we remove from an account code point of view or something like that. So if we ever go to a backup, we can remove it and we have a process that's in place. But we also need to consider as well the spirit of GDPR. If that happens and that comes into place and then I phone up again and say, well, hang on a minute, I asked you to remove my data, and you deal with that in a sensible way, you apologise, you explain the situation and you remove me and put something in place to stop that happening again. Realistically, the GDPR will see that you are in the spirit of what they're trying to do, which is to protect my data. Again, we'll have to wait till May to see exactly how that pans out, but my honest opinion is it's not going to be those sort of circumstances that really get cracked down on. I could be wrong, but I think we've got to look at being sensible with this and trying to comply with the spirit of GDPR. And if we do that, then we're going to be basically in the right sort of space to stay compliant. The next one, which I'm just going to touch on, is data protection officers, or DPOs. Now, these are making a lot of news because they're seen as a big step. Now, it's unlikely to affect anyone on this webinar from what I understand of having a look at people who are here. I could be wrong, but for most small and medium-sized businesses, this isn't going to be the case. I mean, you have to have a DPO if you're a public authority. If you're carrying out large-scale monitoring or processing of data, or if you're dealing with anything regarding criminal convictions and things like that. So the chances of actually having to have a DPO in place are pretty rare. It is also worth noting as well, obviously my advice today isn't legal advice, I'm not a lawyer, but actually this isn't really a legal process, a legal kind of problem. This is about process. This is about making sure that we're doing the best practice stuff with our data, that we're protecting our networks, we're doing all the sensible stuff. And actually a lot of larger firms aren't employing lawyers in the kind of data protection officers roles. They're employing people that understand the business, that understand marketing, that understand the customer journey within the company, and understand IT security. So actually, in general, the chances are you guys that are on the webinar that are here because of the interests of your business are probably quite well placed to kind of head this up. And although you won't officially have to be a data protection officer, you will be someone that's driving that because of your understanding of your business. Okay, so let's move on to the second stage. Now, this is about security. Now, the security side of things is actually a lot more straightforward and there's a lot less grey area. And let me just start. This is advice that we've been given, and we haven't really changed this advice now for about 18 months, 2 years, something along those lines. And what we ask businesses is, first and foremost, could you pay a 50k ransom? So I mentioned that the ransoms are ranging up to around 50k. So in the worst case scenario, could you pay that were you to suffer a data breach? So someone hacked in your system, stole important data, whether that was all your customer data, or the records of how people deal with you, or whether that's drawings or blueprints or whatever it is. Someone did that and said, right, that's now encrypted. Could you pay a 50k ransom? Could you also lose up to 6 months of data? In the worst case scenario, from when a company contacted us that wanted help, they hadn't been following their own data backup process. So they'd been basically not replacing their backup media every single night, and it had been overwriting night after night after night for 6 months. So when it came to having a piece of ransomware go on their system, they couldn't actually get their data back because that backup was encrypted as well, and they had the problem of potentially losing up to 6 months worth of data. Could you explain a data breach? Again, we've been contacted by a company that deal with public bodies, so local councils and things like that, and they effectively said there's no way we can go back to our suppliers and tell them we've had a data breach. They'll never deal with us again. So could you explain a data breach to your customers, to your suppliers, or to anyone else that's involved in that if that were to happen? And finally, could you comply with GDPR? So we've been talking about this for a while, but it's actually been bottom of our list, because realistically, if we worry about the first three, then we do comply with GDPR most of the time. If we're taking it seriously and we're thinking about what could happen, then we do start complying with GDPR. And let me explain why. So what is happening from a cybersecurity point of view? Why is GDPR here? Yes, monetization, and yes, it's important to have one line of legislation and all of that. But what's happened? What is happening right now? So we've got more attacks. So year on year, we're up 55% in terms of value, mostly due to these what they call super cases, where large sums of money are involved. So they're getting better at getting money out of this, basically. So it's not just that there's more strains of malware; it's actually that they're better at actually monetizing them as well. We are seeing this heightened level of complexity as well. So, of course, cybersecurity software is becoming more complex and better at stopping things. And therefore, the actual software that needs to hack systems is becoming better and more complex. Ultimately, we're building walls all around our businesses in terms of cybersecurity. The cyber criminals are either trying to knock them down or get under them or get over them or find a way past them one way or another. So it's our job to build up those walls, but it's, of course, the cyber criminals' job to knock them down. And there's more monetization now. I mean, we're getting to the point where it's estimated that around 80% of all viruses at all are directly monetized. There's also a theory that of the 20%, they're generally trials to say, do they work, and eventually monetize them. So people are looking to make money out of this. There's more monetization, they're getting better at it, and there's more and more attacks. So what we're seeing is obviously pretty severe. So why is it happening? So it does make money. Little statistic in terms of Russia. So the average wage in Russia is about $500 US. For a cyber criminal, it's reportedly around 7,500. So this does work for the cyber criminals. In the UK, it was estimated that the average attack was around £8,600 to the person that carried out that attack. So it's worth putting in time more than ever. We also know it's being made easy, not by everyone, but certainly by some companies who aren't taking it seriously. It's being made easy. We see the situation of companies that have been hacked, done nothing about it, and then been hacked again. And that's because they're going to have a massive red flag against them. If they've paid a ransom, or if they've gone to backup, or they've whatever they've done, they've been hacked, they've been seen as vulnerable, they'll be hacked again. It's pretty clear. Again, if you were the cyber criminal, you would do exactly that. You'd go for the low-lying fruit and the people that were easy. So it is being made easy. And the final one, very hard to trace. So, of course, if I was a cyber criminal, that means that I would be incredibly clever and I'd know exactly what I was doing when it came to writing viruses. And one of the first things I'd do is I'd make sure that it wasn't easily traceable back to me. In terms of payment, they're using things like Bitcoins, which is a currency that, again, is very difficult to trace. And of course, we have this cross-border restriction in terms of punishment. So even if I could find out who the person was who's hacked me, whether that's, I've picked Russia, but it's obviously not just Russia where this is happening, all over the world. So somebody, I don't know, in South Africa, I find out it's them, and I look to get some retribution. I report that to police. There's actually virtually no chance of that happening because those cross-border restrictions mean that there's no communication really between those two countries and saying, yes, I will hand over this person because they've committed offence in your country. It does exist between some countries, but unfortunately, again, cyber criminals know where they don't exist and where they can effectively have that safe haven. Okay, let me just explain very quickly the sort of attack and how this pans out in real life. Because it's very easy to talk about cybercrime and how it happens, but let's talk about a real life scenario. So in many cases, this comes via email. So an email will go into an end user looking very genuine, with the idea of bypassing any spam defense. So obviously, if they've got spam defense, if they haven't got any, they can go straight through. But the idea being that it looks genuine, comes from a genuine looking email address, effectively a bit like how you would treat it if you were an email marketer, making sure you get through to the end user. Of course, then that is opened by the end user, and then what the virus is effectively looking for is what permissions does that PC have. So chances are that PC can talk to the server because it needs to access files or applications, and from there it uses those permissions to then encrypt that data that it can see for ransom. So pretty straightforward here. Email in, bypassing spam defense, getting straight through to the server and encrypting data. So this is what we would see as a very sort of common attack by someone that doesn't have the necessary defences in place. A different approach, which we saw about 2 or 3 months ago, kind of hit across small and medium-sized businesses across the UK, was, again, if you've got the right software, you know what you're doing, going out there and finding root or IP addresses that are public. So this could be for things like remote access or web services that are legitimately out there in the public domain, and with the right piece of software, finding what they are, finding the open port on that router so it can then connect directly to that router, and then ultimately using a brute force technique, so what's referred to as a dictionary attack or a brute force attack, where it's trying multiple times different usernames, different passwords in order to access that server via the router, and then of course encrypting the data for ransom. Now in both these cases there's loads and loads of things that can be done to protect them, and we've obviously seen major spikes in this ransomware approach as the end game, but in terms of how it's actually deployed, there are lots of different ways to do that. So there really are, from looking at that, two major concerns about GDPR, and that's being hacked and then obviously losing your data or having your data encrypted, and being reported by not following processes. So being reported, as I've hopefully shown you, is all about best practice and following best practice when it comes to managing your data and how you look after it. And being hacked is all about putting in the right protection. So obviously, as you know from HVP, we're an IT security specialist. We work with a company called Sophos. So what I want to show you now is the sort of approach we're recommending that businesses take, and the full stack, the full amount of things that you could do to protect yourselves. Now, what I want to be clear here is that GDPR talks about a necessary level of protection. So, for example, a business that employs 5 people and deals with relatively simple in terms of the importance of that data, so maybe it's just names, addresses, email addresses, compared to a doctor's surgery that's got medical history, etc., etc. They are going to be treated differently, and necessary steps are going to be different when it comes to a small business to a large business and the sensitivity of data between them. So you have to take that into consideration. But again, if there was a data breach, effectively the question that is going to get asked of you is, have you done enough? And you need to be confident to say, yes, we have. So we're going to start off by looking at network configuration. So in terms of your IT network, how it's set up. Now, it's key to say here, this isn't a one-time fix. It's not about setting things up and leaving them and that's it. We know this is going to change. We know that the cyber crime and cyber security world is changing on a daily basis as new strains of viruses are found, as I showed on one of my early slides. It keeps growing and growing and growing. So this is the approach that we recommend. So sorry for the slightly busy slide, but if I start on the left, network configuration. So the solutions that we have for that sort of thing are about setting up your network from an advanced point of view. So actually considering cybercrime when it comes to setting things up, as opposed to just pure functionality. About increasing and regularly updating the complexity of usernames and passwords. There's a little bit of debate around this, around whether or not you should have very complex passwords that you change every now and again, or you should change them on a regular basis. Of course, doing both is the best thing, but you have to strike a balance for your end users to make sure that they don't become lazy. And from all the presentations I do, certainly from a face-to-face point of view, passwords are a massive issue. Passwords are a massive, massive issue in that users do not take them seriously. So there has to be a level of configuration here that forces that process in place. And backup solution and a procedure in place. So not showing that backup solution, but making sure people are changing the media, or we're having something automatically run that does that to make sure we're backing things up. So then over on the right, this is what we offer as a company. So we have our advanced security framework, which is our proactive approach to cybersecurity. So a person coming out regularly and setting things up and adapting your settings to make sure that you're constantly up to date with cybersecurity. Remote monitoring, so any issues can be identified early. On-site and remote backup, so we offer 2 levels of backup. Message defense or Sophos Pure Mail, which are our mail protection, so stopping things coming in right at the beginning. And the latest development is around synchronized security. So this is effectively saying that if my PC right in front of me now got infected, actually the network will quarantine it straight away. It would be talking to things, it would see that it's been infected, and it would immediately stop it talking to anything else. So quarantining it off the system and stopping that virus spread. Okay, and then the next side of things about outdated equipment. You may have seen this sort of mentioned when it came to the NHS about talking about XP machines and things like that. It is a massive risk. And basically what we're talking about here is that ultimately products like Windows XP, but actually every kind of piece of software that you use, will eventually stop being supported by the vendor. And when they say stop being supported, what they mean is they're going to stop developing the software in any way, but they're also going to stop releasing any patches. And almost always patches are about security. They've found a flaw in their system that can be exploited, and they've released a patch to stop that happening in the future. And I heard a crazy statistic the other day that said on average it takes IT departments between 3 and 6 months to roll out patches after they've been released. So it's really important, obviously, to have a strategy around patching, but also to use updated equipment where those patches are coming out. So again, equipment and software. So the solution: patch and update operating systems and software, and replace old equipment completely. So something like Windows XP, you should not have those machines in your organization now. And in that example that I gave around the router, in all of those cases that we saw, the router was outdated. It was an old router that hadn't had security updates, so it was unable to see that brute forcing. It was unable to see those dictionary attacks, which it could have stopped from a kind of modern, up-to-date router in the middle of that system, basically. So in terms of our products and our solutions for this, we have our proactive essential maintenance, which, like I say, is similar to our advanced security frameworks, but this is from our basic network maintenance point of view. So looking after your network in terms of removing old users, putting on things like Windows Server updates, which is the Windows SUS, Windows Server 2016, so having the latest Windows Server in place that's supported, so Windows 2016 being the latest one, but making sure you're not on something like Windows SBS 2003, 2008, which are completely unsupported now, and moving towards things that are being supported by the vendor. Sophos UTM, which is our recommendation of firewall and web control. And Windows 10, again, this is an example, but making sure you're on the latest operating system. So Windows 8 still supported. Windows 7 is currently in extended support, which means that there are still security patches available, but it's going in a couple of years. Windows 8, Windows 10 obviously still fully supported. So making sure we're getting rid of all that kind of old, outdated equipment and bringing in the stuff that's going to be fully supported and patched. And then the final one, which is a word that's used in IT quite a lot, the PEDCAC, so the problem that exists between the chair and the computer. So that's me, that's you, that's everyone you work with. Don't eliminate yourself from this at all. We're all idiots, I'm afraid. We all make mistakes. We all do things that we shouldn't do. And this has been a major issue for a long time in cybersecurity, because actually we could do everything I've just mentioned and still have a problem, because I could bypass all of that security by doing something stupid like opening an email I shouldn't, like going and plugging in a memory stick that had a virus on it, and bypassing all of that security. So there's been a lot of advancements here in this area around users. So the solution really here is about educating users, about restricting access, and about enforcing security policy, some of which is covered by what we've talked about already, but educating users is absolutely key. And also protecting against stupidity. So even you can tell people all the things in the world, but sometimes people have a bad day, they do something that they shouldn't do. So making sure that if that happens, there's actually a level of defense there. So antivirus is quite common. If I move to the product, Sophos antivirus, I'm sure everyone on this webinar has got antivirus, but we're actually now looking at moving to advanced forms of antivirus, and it's something called InterceptX from Sophos. And what that's basically doing is, rather than looking at known strains of viruses, which is what antivirus does, so effectively what's called signatures, so it looks at the signatures of anything that's coming in and say, do I recognize that? If the answer is yes, it's a virus, it stops it dead in its tracks. If no, it lets it through. What InterceptX is doing is looking at behavior. So it's saying, let's stick on the ransomware theme. A piece of ransomware comes in that's never been seen before by the antivirus, so it comes through and it starts rapidly encrypting files. What InterceptX is doing is it's looking for behavior. So it's saying, hang on a minute, I don't want something rapidly encrypting files. Stop that first and foremost. And it also keeps a little memory of all those files as well before they change, so it can immediately roll them back to that uninfected state. So something like that is very advanced. It only came out at the end of last year, so it's quite new. It's about keeping up to date with what's going on in the world of cybercrime, but really, really important. One of the most popular products Sophos have ever released. An absolute must. It's one we recommended to everyone we talk to. From a similar point of view, CryptoGuard and Sandstorm add a similar level of protection at the server side of things. We then have encryption. Now, for a GDPR webinar, I have not talked much about encryption, but it is specifically referred to in GDPR. It's almost your golden bullet when it comes to GDPR, in that if you were to have a data breach and all of your data was encrypted, so again, it's similar sort of process to ransomware, but in the opposite way, in that you've encrypted all of your data, and the only people that can see that data are either people that are on your network, i.e. your employees, or people you've given explicit permission to do so. Well, if it gets out to somebody else, they can't even see that. It's just a jumbled up mess of characters and letters if they haven't got the passwords or the encryption keys that unscramble that. So it is absolutely key, and it's one that has probably had quite a slow uptake in the last few years, but we're expecting to see a massive uptake between now and May as people realise just how much it can protect them against kind of the elements of GDPR. Sophos Fish Threat, which again is another product that's recent about educating staff, and I'm going to give you a little example of this because I believe that educating staff is absolutely key. And from doing training sessions myself, I know that a lot of staff are terrified of clicking on the wrong thing, but they just want to do their jobs and they don't know whether they should click on it or not. Certainly people that are picking up things like CVs and things like that, where the person that's sending it to them is definitely unknown. There's a file attachment to it that they're worried about. So we'll give some examples of how that kind of educates your staff. And then MDM, so mobile device management, certainly for businesses that have got a lot of mobile users. You may all remember the Ministry of Defence laptop that was left on a London train a few years ago. This is to kind of stop exactly that, so loss of devices so we can remotely wipe them, but also we can control the data on those devices as well and make sure that obviously things like viruses don't get into critical areas of that device and steal our data. So I hope you see that there's lots of different things that we can do, and we see that as a control, protect and educate process. So controlling your network and making sure it's set up properly, protecting your network in terms of the way that you've got the correct devices on there, that you're patching them, that you're looking after them, and educating your staff and making sure that they understand what's going on. Now, just very quickly, I'll just show you this because we think it's really cool. We use it at HBP. It's worked wonders in terms of educating our staff. So this is Sophos Fish Threat. So effectively what we do here is we have a bunch of dodgy looking emails, and there's loads and loads of these. They keep adding to it as well. So for example, I could pick that Amazon Prime one in the sort of center left and say, right, I'm going to send that to all my staff. I'm then going to say, right, if anyone does click on that and anyone's tricked by it, I'm going to give them, let's say, the basic phishing tips in the top left, just so they understand what phishing and the idea of trying to hack someone via email is all about. And then what I can also do as well, by the way, is I can not send out the trick email and I can just send out training. So I can send out all of this training, just say, right, all my staff have got to do this. And if I do that, or I send a trick campaign out, effectively I can get a report. So this is one that we sent out at HBP that went out just to do with training. You can see here, we screenshotted this pretty much straight after it went out. We sent out 75 emails, 11 were started, 2 were completed, and we could report at a user level who those people are. So actually who's completing that training, who's doing it. And if I were sending out emails, and what we tend to do is we tend to try and make that as specific as possible. So to the sales team, we might send out LinkedIn ones. To the finance team, we might send out HSBC ones. Whatever it is that's going to seem reasonable, we can then report and say, right, who's clicked on it, who's opened that, who's followed it through, and if they have they then done the training as well? So we can start identifying potential risk areas in our business in terms of individuals, which means that we can either obviously do some training on them, we can go back through things with that, or in the worst case scenario, we can find out if there's somewhere else where those people can go and work. But ideally what you want to do is obviously train those people and get them up to scratch, or identify where there's potential risk and where there's additional help needed. And just to show you what that did in our organisation, so we did the Amazon Prime one. There was an email that went around straight after. You see the one on the left where basically our staff start looking out for each other. So they send an email out that says, be careful, there's a dodgy email going around. And actually we spread that out over a week. So rather than them all going out at once and creating a huge level of suspicion, we did start spreading them out. We also use something called Yammer, which, if you haven't heard of it, is part of Office 365. It's like a business Facebook almost, where we can share information amongst staff. And again, something went up on there with a screenshot of the email to say, look out for this. So actually now we get our staff looking out for each other and helping each other when it comes to cyber security, which honestly is a fantastic place to be. That is exactly where you want to be. Okay, so where am I? Let me just get my screen right here. I've just there we go. Right, okay. So apologies for the horrible picture, but just to finish off, this is the way we look at cybersecurity, whether it's about GDPR or not, and that's in terms of phishing nets. So if you think of, you put antivirus in your business, it's the only thing you've got, it's a single phishing net, there's still plenty of holes in that. We put Intercept X on that, we put a firewall on it, we start training our staff. Each and every time we start adding another layer of defense, another phishing net on top, and the holes get smaller and smaller and smaller. As I mentioned right at the beginning, cyber criminals are always going to try and find a way through, but our job is to make that as difficult as we possibly can for them. And again, from a GDPR point of view, that's exactly where we need to be to say we have taken the necessary measures to protect our business. Okay, just to finish up, so what next? What happens next? Well, realistically, this is over to you guys now. Ultimately, GDPR is your responsibility. You need to do something about it, and you need to be happy that your business is protected, and more importantly, the data that you're holding is protected. As like I say, the spirit of GDPR is all about the consumer data. Now, we do offer free reviews in terms of your cybersecurity, so if you want someone to check it out and have a look and see if you're safe, obviously give us a shout. We're more than happy to help with that. From a data process point of view, obviously we're an IT security company. Data processing and marketing is not our background. Hopefully you can see that it should be straightforward. It should be about best practice. Personally, I'm leaning on companies that supply CRM systems and email marketing systems for advice, and they're being very good, and they're giving advice where they can. But like I say, it's generally saying follow best practice and make sure you kind of follow what you should have been doing for the last couple of years anyway. But that's the direction I go with that if you need to do. But from a security point of view, like I say, we're here to help if you need us. If anyone has any questions, feel free to fire them through on the chat. Alternatively, I've put my personal email address up on screen. Feel free to contact me directly as well. And if there are no questions, then thank you very much, and have a brilliant day.